Our speaker today is Mike Wuthrich. He is Assistant Director at CGIS. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Ankara, Turkey. And his interests include Middle East politics, parties and party systems, electoral behavior, religion, and nationalism. He gave this lecture as part of a workshop, teacher workshop that we did over the weekend. And I'm glad that he agreed to do sort of an encore performance. So you'll be getting a more polished presentation.
Thanks, Bart. Thanks for coming today. So I'm always excited to talk about Turkey. It's my favorite research area, and probably all of you were aware of the fact that there was some strange goings on in Turkey this summer, and people over here, I think, really had a hard time wrapping their, minds around what that was really about. And in fact, there was a lot of there was even discussion and naming of it as a Turkish Spring or whatever, which was absolutely ridiculous and kind of both insulting to the Arab Spring and to what was going on in Turkey, but it certainly was a significant event. And so today, I'll kind of give you an outline of the event, of what happened mostly in June, at the very end of May, and then the first few weeks of June. And then actually, what's interesting is I'd like to unravel kind of what was happening behind the scenes there, and that there's both a huge ironic component to what was happening in those protests, and also there was a lot of symbolism. The space that was being contested, the symbols were pretty significant. So I'm mentioning that, and of course there was definitely a lot of pepper spray. So my friends in Turkey mentioned everybody got a little teary-eyed during the protests. Pretty much wherever they were at in the country, there was definitely a lot of that. So, this is a mall, right? And when you think about, if you heard about the event, you know that there was something going on about a mall, and people were really, upset about a mall being set. And in Turkish mindset, this is probably pretty close to what they envision in terms of what a big gaudy building full of all kinds of materialistic goodies on the inside, high-end items, kind of provincial items and whatnot, but a mall. But somehow in the center in June, we see this kind of reaction to a mall being built, okay, by people. It got pretty crazy, lots of protesters, things got turned over. We also, police was doing these kinds of shenanigans. There were a lot of protesters. Basically, there was a green space in Istanbul, a park, that basically nobody used. In fact, the park in my memory, I was actually familiar with the park too, it's, in my mind, associated mostly with underhanded dealings, during the day, and then during Ramadan, that's where the Istanbul municipal government set up their tents during Ramadan, where they would, at the breaking of the fast, people would come and eat there, whatever. But other than that, it was kind of an unused space next to a fairly famous tourist area. But the original protests got, and this is it, some of the comics that came out of the protests. This is the Turkish Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Give you an example of Turkish humor, but you don't need interpretation for that, that's close enough. But yeah, cutting down the green space, challenging democracy. Was this a challenge to democracy? What was this really? And why? What was going on? Why did so many people, the first few days, right, the sit-ins at the park began around 28th, 29th of May. People began to sit in the park as it was beginning to be there were beginning to be development there for a mall. And for a few days it was kind of under the radar, but then the police kind of acted with brutality toward the protesters on the 30th or the 31st in those days. And then all of a sudden it was in the news everywhere in Turkey, and you started seeing lots of people joining the protests or doing their own protests at the center squares of their own cities around the country. Okay, why would that, what's the big deal about a mall, right? It doesn't really make sense. Or is Turkish population just extremely environmentalist? Like, what's really going on there? We need to process that. And this is where the irony comes in. This is an overhead view of the park in question. So there's kind of a big landmark building here, and then this is the park. This is Guzzi Park, where all the craziness started. And some developers had begun to tear up some trees around, one of the corners of the park. And this is kind of a famous central area of Istanbul. There's a statue here, a lot of open space. So it's close to some important areas, but there's the mall. And actually, there was no intentional mystery to this, but this is actually the development plan for that green space. The mall was going to be a replica Ottoman barracks, like a replica rebuild of Ottoman barracks that had actually existed there at the end of the Ottoman Empire and then had been torn down in the 1930s or 40s. So, and the developers, this is the developers' plans, they intended to resurrect or keep a lot of the green space in the first place. So here the idea was, in this tourist area, it was basically a municipal development project that was supported by the municipality, obviously, but initiated by government programs. Like it was definitely connected to the ruling governing party, this development in Istanbul. So they're going to put in, this replica barracks. Well, why would this was the same? This is a picture of that original space. It was the barracks were there for a number of decades, and then torn down. And of course, that's how the park came to be in the first place. You tear down the barracks, and you have this huge open central courtyard, of the marshalling grounds of the barracks. They just planted trees in there and tore down the walls. And so the development project was simply to put it back in, right? There wasn't going to be a huge change in that regard, okay? So one interesting aspect of the protests is that truly a good portion of the protesters had been heard and were mobilized on the idea of the gaudy Turkish mall cutting out all the green space. The picture in their mind harkened back to that initial picture that we gave. Some of them weren't even aware of the actual development plans. But some were, and they were still protesting. And that brings us to the second question, like why would people be so up in arms about fairly attractive replica rebuild, and then putting in some shops and stores in an area that's already got a lot of shops and stores, where they were kind of, for the most part, going to just incorporate the green space into, using a normally empty space, turning into something useful and economically viable, and probably would, at least help some people make money in the area. So why was there still a problem or an issue with this? Well, it goes back actually to Turkish history. during the Ottoman Empire, this is a picture of the area that would have been the center of Istanbul, the center of the Ottoman Empire at that time. What's an obvious feature of that area? Mosques, right? The minarets stick out. This, of course, is the famous Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine, or the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor, Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian built this in 580, right? And it's still standing. It's a magnificent structure. It was later converted into a mosque. It's been a museum for quite a while, about 70, 80 years. So, but you have this kind of structure that served as a mosque during the Ottoman Empire, and then what we know in English as the Blue Mosque, it's the Sultan Ahmet Mosque in Turkish, and then there's actually, if we broaden the picture, it would be, that you would see even more minarets. This is another view of that, and of course it was a spectacular center of the city, this old Ottoman center of the city. The palace was there, you had the Blue Mosque overlooking the Marmara here, and then the Bosphorus coming along over here. It was quite a picturesque area, but of course there was a problem with that, and then there was a problem when when the Ottoman Empire became the Turkish Republic. A drastic change was made. Where's the capital of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, is now Ankara, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't an accident, right? And it wasn't merely strategic, like, oh, we formed a new country, it's better to have our capital more in the center of the country. I'm sure that didn't escape, the notice of Ataturk, but that wasn't the only reason, really. And one of the reasons is Istanbul was far too Ottoman. There was too much Ottoman history, too much Islam, too much Ottoman history in Istanbul. And so they chose Ankara. Ankara was an interesting little town, in the middle of the Anatolian plateau that was extremely culturally diverse. And one of the things that didn't have hardly any of when Ataturk moved in and the founder of the Republic moved in and set up the government there, one thing it conspicuously didn't have was mosques. And a lot of my more devout Turkish friends still kind of under their breath referred their nickname for Ankara is the city without a mosque or a prayer room, the city without a prayer room or whatever. That wasn't an accident. And one of the things that Ataturk and the early Republican founders did when they founded the Republic, you had this shift from an empire with a sultan and caliph, like a spiritual and political ruler, and suddenly you're going to a republic ruled by the people. This seems like a drastic shift. And you've had this sultan, caliph, political, spiritual leader for hundreds of years, right? Since Sultan Selim took Baghdad in the 16th century, they took the caliphate along with their sultanate. So this political structure had existed for a long time, and of course the early founders were worried that a reversion was going to be highly likely. And so one of the first things they did, obviously, is try to disassociate themselves from the Ottoman Empire and, in fact, disparage it. So the early founders, when they created the history books, for the education history books for children, intentionally either mostly jumped over the Ottoman Empire or used it as a bad example of decadence, laziness, immorality, backwardness, about everything that you could, every word label that you could use that would be negative, something you wouldn't want to live in. They used the Ottoman Empire as an example for that for children, right? And for especially the early decades of the Turkish Republic, there was no even social glorification of the Ottoman Empire. It was seen as subversive, honestly, and some of the early social friction appeared to be simply over people who were hearkening back to Ottoman culture, wearing traditional Ottoman clothes or whatever. Ataturk was very sensitive about that sort of reversion. So in Istanbul, they intentionally changed what was understood to be the center of the city for this very reason. And this is a map of Istanbul, and you see here, this is where those, the blue Sultan Ahmet Mosque, or the Blue Mosque, and the Hagia Sophia, which mosque at that time, Hagia Sophia Church originally, were right over here. This was, and then the palace and all of that was over at this juncture of the city. This is the Marmara, this is the Bosphorus here, and this is the Golden Horn. Okay, so this is all Europe on this side. This is the Asian side of Istanbul. So the center of Istanbul was here. Ataturk and the Republican founders actually moved the center of town, the center space, across the Golden Horn to this area traditionally called Pera. And they created a center square in Taksim. And this is Taksim here. And you see there's kind of a central circular square we'll kind of focus in on. You'll see what's there in a second. But this is that central area again. And this was made to be understood as the center of the city. And feeding into that square is a very famous street called Istiklal Caddesi. And it's probably, if any of you have been to Istanbul, there's a good chance you've been on this street because it's famous. Tons of shops, tons of cafes, lots of neat things. And if you look at the architecture, the architecture is modern, European, not necessarily, like modern, more modern, but a lot of it, and if we looked at other pictures, you would very clearly see more of a European architectural structure, that sort of thing. And prominently, no mosques, right? There were synagogues, there were churches, right? There wasn't a mosque there.
Is there a McDonald's?
Oh yes, oh for sure. Always a McDonald's. Here's the square again, and I'm sorry, this is the park. This is the central square that we're talking about, that's seen as the center of the Turkish Republic in Istanbul. And this is that Istiklal Street, Istiklal Caddesi. Okay? So people come out, they walk down here. It's usually a crowded street. They walk down here and pour out to here. And in the history of the Turkish Republic, this, of course, was the center of all protest. I mean, it's a very famous protest pathway. Walking down Istiklal Street, pouring out into this central area. And of course, this building right here, which you can even almost tell from its roof that it's a little bit of an eyesore, is the Ataturk Cultural Center. So that was also built right next to the center. Okay, that wasn't accidental either. It's kind of an old building. It's getting to be a little bit of an eyesore, but of course it has a lot of obvious symbolic value. So, and here's the park, right? The park is in this kind of central location in the city. And of course that statue in the middle is the center of that. And in the center of the statue is Ataturk. Yes. On both sides. There's two different, on one side there's a group of people with Ataturk in the center. You go around to the other side, also a group of people with Ataturk in the center. And the interesting thing in Turkey is all the cities, with almost without exception, if you go to what's considered the center of their city, you're going to find a statue of Ataturk. Okay? So this is a very symbolic state. So for those of, if you think back about the mall, right, this nice replica Ottoman barracks, rebuilding of Ottoman barracks in this contested space, you can understand why another segment of the population was also bothered in terms of the protests. So another interesting facet of this is a superimposed, but of course this is a superimposed picture that was created by Turks, and I'll tell you why. So the current prime minister made his fame as the mayor of Istanbul, okay? And I think if there were Turks sitting in this room, even that were vehemently opposed to Erdogan, they would have to begrudgingly admit that he revitalized this city. I mean, in the 1994, when he took over as mayor, and he was with a different party at that time, actually a more Islamist one. When he took over the city, you couldn't even cross the Golden Horn without having something on your nose. I mean, it was like sewage. And within 4 years, before he was briefly put in prison for reciting a poem by a famous Turkish poet. I mean, there's all kinds of paradoxes here, but in the 4 years that he was mayor, he really developed the city in ways that were unescapably better. Okay, and that's also what really had propelled him and his party into power later. He broke off from the Islamist party, formed a group of a coalition on the center right. He was maybe a little bit more devout. The leaderships were more devout than other parties on the center right, but they were formed of the same coalition group. But one of the things that he tried to do during his mayoralship that became really controversial, the one thing he tried to do that got him into trouble was he suggested that they should build a mosque in this central area, right in Taksim area, the central area of Istanbul. People flipped out, it got crazy, and this was in the late 90s, and they scrapped that project. Well, it's interesting, here he comes with this capitalistic development plan, which I don't think he was reading too much into the symbols of the Ottoman barracks, honestly, not as much as some people were. But, all of a sudden you have what could be good for the city and good for tourism and development. You have all these people protesting against it, and what he saw was a huge, wide cross-section of youth of all types. Very devout youth people, doing their prayers while they were protesting and things, which, for Turks, that's saying something. Like if you're actually doing your prayers, that's really unusual in Turkey, especially doing it out in public. That's a sign of what people normally associate with supporters of him, right? So he was seeing all of these different people protesting of all types, just young people, very vibrant. And so actually in the midst of all of this, about on June 3rd, another interesting thing about the prime minister, he's a very interesting personality. He came from a very middle-class background in Istanbul and has, the Turkish version of like a Joe Sixpack politician. And some of his popularity is simply because he is rough around the edges, which is very different actually than the other leaders within his own party. They're much more like distinguished, dignified elite in terms of how they carry themselves. He's got this kind of rough around the edges, tough guy kind of way of speaking that some Turks are like, oh yeah, I'd do the same thing too. They kind of like him because, yeah, I'd say something stupid, and so he must be good. But in the midst of all the protests, he was actually, despite to the horror of his party, he was actually instigating trouble, like during the protests. He just kept saying really inflammatory remarks that even his closest friends separated themselves from in the party, which is something interesting that we should come back to. But one of the things he said, which appeared to be an unabashed attempt to split the opposition against each other was to say, well, we can scrap the mall. That's not a bad idea, or we could do that. Let's just build a mosque in that space instead. Which, of course, that really didn't work. I mean, in fact, the religious newspapers in Turkey after that, soundly criticized him for the obvious appeal or kind of underhanded appeal to try to distract people from what was going on. But it died down. I mean, this happened in May. It looked really crazy in the first week of June. Certainly by June 20, there was just a little pepper spray gas in the air, and that was about it. Everything was gone. So, the question is, oops. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. What are the ramifications or repercussions? Like, is anything going to come of this? Well, an interesting thing about the protest, and again, why I think one reason it was significantly different than anything that happened in the Arab uprisings in the Arab Spring, is that in the course of all of this, we're talking about 3 dead total from the protest. One protester was hit by a car by another civilian who was probably angry at the protesters. One police officer chasing protesters slipped on some water and fell off of a bridge and died. And one protester actually died in a conflict with the police. So despite all of what appeared to be lots of water, lots of pepper spray, there were injuries too, but it was very different than the so-called peaceful uprisings in Tahrir Square that had 500 plus fatalities in that short amount of what seemed to be fairly non-violent in the way that we framed it. We're talking about, and then we don't even want to get into Bahrain or without question Syria or some of the other cases. This was different, and it died down, and they weren't protesting. They weren't protesting regime type. They weren't protesting They weren't protesting against the right for democratic rule or anything like that, which was more of an issue in the other case. But is this gone and forgotten? Once the gas cleared, will things be forgotten? I don't think so. I have a number of reasons to believe and anticipate that this is the beginning of the end, certainly for Erdogan, but it's also going to affect the party at least in the short term, if not permanently. There's local elections coming up quickly, and quick enough that I don't think he's going to completely be able to distance himself from what happened. And if a major municipality like Istanbul or Ankara switches from his party, that could and if the other parties that take over those municipalities do a decent job, that would traditionally, in terms of how Turkish voters behave, doing local governance is a big advance in terms of how people vote for you nationally. The other issue is presidential elections. Well, the prime minister, before this protest, had really become a dominant force, like a worryingly dominant force. There was questions about whether anybody in his party could control him or whatever. And one of the scariest aspects of this development is in the course of wanting to create a new liberal civilian constitution, which everybody in Turkey wanted, he was also throwing in this line writer that, oh, by the way, we're going to change Turkey's democratic system from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. Interesting. Why would you make such a sudden change? Well, because in a parliamentary system, the president, the way that it's set up in Turkey, the president is still some sort of a balance of power to the prime minister. And the prime minister, of course, is the more powerful person, which he is, but there's still this veto power in the president. But if it was a presidential system, and he, I think, assumed that he would become president, then he'd be able to select the government himself, right, without having any accountability to the parliament, and it would get out of the he would get out of the loophole. In Turkey, presidents, once you take on the presidential mantle, the understanding is that you're not a party leader, a member of your party anymore, which is important because in his own party document, he can't be the leader after 2015. Like, his time's up. So he's trying to find a loophole so that he can still be the man on top without breaking his own rules, right? Which would completely discredit him. After the Gezi protests, basically the Gezi protests strengthened other leaders within his party against him. Any chance that Turkey's going to switch to a presidential system is totally out the window. And but he can run as president in August 2014. And if we think of plurality of the vote, this will be the first time that the Turkish population will vote for the president, because it's a parliamentary system in Turkey. In the past, the president was selected by the parliament. In 2014, it'll be selected by the people in August 2014. And the people may vote for him, but after that, he can't really go back. And this has happened in all of Turkish history. When a prime minister opts into the presidency, it spells at least short-term doom for they've always, because usually that powerful figure has created a party that's mostly his own. And so if he moves out of the party, people are less certain, less sure about the party without his guidance. If he moves into the presidency, it's likely going to cause his party to falter electorally, and I'll show you why that's so crucial. And then in 2015, there are parliamentary elections. So Erdogan, the prime minister, his party came into government during what they refer to as the tsunami election of 2002. And basically what happened is that there were 6 parties in parliament. Every single one of them lost all representation of their party. In fact, the party with the largest plurality, had 22% of the vote in the previous election, and they got 2% of the vote in 2002. And in Turkey, there's a 10% national threshold that you have to pass to get any representation. So all those parties went under, and 2 parties who were out of parliament actually came in. Which also created an interesting situation. So in 2002, when people went to the polls and voted, they ended up only 53.7% of the voters got any representation for who they voted for in parliament in terms of the seats. So the opposition party was voted, 19.4% of the population voted for the opposition party. They got 178 seats. AK Party, getting only 34.4% of the vote, got 363 seats. Very close to a 2/3 majority. In 2007, basically what happened was, in Turkey's history, they had all of these inefficient, poorly functioning parties that basically, in the 2002 election, killed them. And so what's been happening since then is the voters from those old parties are being rechanneled into the ones that survived, creates a important. Eventually, in the beginning, it helped the AK Party, but as the last election in 2011, almost all the voters voted for parties that had representation in parliament, and that's absolutely not likely to change. If anything, it might stay the same, but if anything, if it goes any direction, there's no even realistic likelihood of this number going down. All the other parties have clearly, put up their tombstone and moved on. So even though the governing party's share of the vote has grown, their number of seats are continually declining. And in the last election, the margin between the opposition parties and the governing party has gotten awfully slender. Now, if you know much about party systems, it's a D'Hondt voting system, which is also set up to give a little advantage to the party that gets more votes in each province. But you could see that even if the current governing party loses a little, which these opposition parties are not likely to lose strength. In fact, the last election, they fared poorly because one of the biggest ideologically close parties in opposition to the governing party came out with there was a huge very suspicious, strange sex tape scandal like 2 weeks before the election, where almost all the major top leaders of the party were caught literally with their pants down on YouTube for everybody to see, and they still only lost 1% of their vote. Right? They're not likely to go below what they did in the last election. The other parties are not likely to lose. And so if AK Party slips into a situation where they lose just enough to have to form a coalition government, that also has historically signaled and logically signals a big problem for them in future elections. Another interesting aspect is that, Turkey has a huge young population. So like in the last election, going from 2007 to 2011, 8 million new voters out of 43 million. That's almost 20% additional voters pouring into the system in the last election. And there's likely to be a healthy new jolt in 2015. Well, what was the profile of the Guzzi Park protesters? Young, right? And urban. And that's also particularly a problem for the current governing party. They had shown some success in getting the young vote in 2002 and 2007. But in 2011, they showed that actually they were losing some of their dominance with the new voters, the young voters. The Guzzi Park protest would be additionally worrying. If you think of the governing party as a coalition party, kind of similar to the way we would think of like the Republican Party here or whatever, that it's actually made up of factions that more or less kind of loosely come together. You have that are somewhat, this is not a precise percentage I'm just trying to give you an idea of how they're all important factions. Religious conservatives, economic liberals, social liberals, urban poor, and Kurdish conservatives, I should say, not all Kurds. So these are the kind of the bread and butter coalition of voters that have been voting for the AK Party. And I think there's some important signs that these are being weakened. The Kurdish conservatives, a lot of them backed away from the party in the last election. And if you're just paying attention to what's happening in Turkey in the last couple of days, you'll see that he's making gestures again to try to address his losses with that segment of the population. Urban poor in the last election began to vote increasingly for the major opposition party, which was also an important shift, which I would anticipate was likely to continue regardless. Probably the only faction that's been consistently stable for the current government are the economic liberals. And if you think about the whole protest starting from the building of a mall, you can understand why they support the current party. Liberals have been backing away, and even religious conservatives, which might be surprising. The problem is that the religious conservatives currently don't have an obvious, there's a major faction of their religious conservative group that's very unhappy, and in fact there's good evidence to believe that they were partly responsible for instigating these protests in the first place, but they don't have an obvious alternative place for their vote. So I think in the near future, whether it's slowly or drastically, we're on a downhill turn for the very popular, previously popular Prime Minister of Turkey. And things are structurally set up really against him having much more success. He's kind of at the limit of getting easy gains from the population. Votes have been fairly consolidated, unlikely to squeak one way. He's unlikely to shift more votes away from what's already been taken. And that's going to spell coalition governments, which in Turkey, coalition governments, whenever they've been formed, have always caused no matter if they were successful coalitions or poor coalitions, the dominant party of the coalition is always punished in the election, partly because they have to agree, they have to work together with a minor party. They have to make concessions. Turks don't like that out of their parties. I don't know very many people groups that in general reward their parties for making concessions to other parties, maybe perhaps unfortunately. But this is a problem because there are two options for forming a coalition if they did would be with conservative nationalists or the Kurdish conservatives, the Kurdish, conservative Turkish nationalist party or the leftist Kurdish nationalist party. Either one of as soon as they join with either one of those minor parties, they're going to really bleed from some of these, for obvious reasons, ideological reasons, from major members of their coalition. Okay? That's it.